Chapter 13. Frostbitten Friendship. Nancy found herself intruding upon an unhappy scene when she reached the porch. Frank Semmit was standing, pale and trembling, his fingers twisting nervously in his pockets, his back against the wall. Carson Drew was pacing the floor, his hands behind him, just as Nancy had often seen him in the courtrooms. "What was your income from the pasture lands last year?" Mr. Drew shot forth. "Only about $200, Semmit choked. "Did you give Mr. Sidney an accounting of it?" Mr. Drew demanded. "I spent the money fixing the place up." "In general repairs to the building, or in the restaurant equipment?" Mr. Drew asked. I forget," Semmit said, wiping his brow. "General repairs, of course. Sure, that's right." "The house hasn't been painted," Mr. Drew snapped. "The grounds are ill-kempt. The roof is weather-beaten. What improvements did you make?" "Say, I ain't on no witness stand," Semmit snarled, sounding like a wolf at bay. "I ain't gonna answer questions you ain't got no business asking me." "Very well, then," Mr. Drew replied with unexpected mildness. "Thank you for the cooperation you did extend to me." Semmit's shifty eyes took on a gleam of cunning. "I've been working hard making a living for my family and keeping the old man clean and comfortable and well-fed," he said. "If you think there's any crooked work going on, maybe you're right. I ain't saying nothing one way or another, but if I was you, I'd keep an eye on them two guys who was here this morning, carrying on so disgraceful." Nancy had not interrupted the interview, but kept as still as a mouse in the doorway. Thus it was that Mrs. Semmit did not see her as she stole in from the kitchen and cautiously took up a position at a window close to where her husband was standing. Nancy, from her point of vantage, could see Semmit on the porch and the man's wife behind him in the house. As Mr. Drew paced up and down, Mrs. Semmit raised the window little by little, each time his back was turned. Nancy saw the woman, using the cretonne curtain for concealment, crouch down at the opening and whisper something to her husband. A relieved look came over the man's face. Then, keeping his eyes on Mr. Drew, he cautiously pulled a bulky manila envelope from beneath his jacket and held it behind him. Mrs. Semmit's hand reached out for it. "Yes, Mr. Drew," Semmit went on. "And what's more, I think each one of them fellers suspects the other of sneaking things out of the old man's room. I don't know what they take, because for all I know, Mr. Sidney ain't got $1 in the world outside of this property." Nancy stepped softly from her place of concealment and walked up behind Mrs. Semmit, whose eager hand swooped out and snatched the envelope from her husband's grasp. Frank Semmit ostentatiously folded his arms and moved away from the window, while his wife surveyed the envelope he had passed to her and then turned noiselessly away. On her face was a look of sneaking triumph mingled with overwhelming curiosity, but that expression was wiped away the second she looked up and saw Nancy confronting her. "What do you want, pussyfooting around?" the woman snapped, her lips white. "Nothing at all," Nancy said with an innocent air. "I was just looking for an envelope." "Oh, you have found it, haven't you?" "Not at all," Mrs. Semmit barked, concealing the envelope beneath her apron. "This is for me, and it just came in the morning mail." "Perhaps you made a mistake," Nancy remarked. "May I look at the address?" "You may not," Mrs. Semmit retorted. "I guess a body has a right to some privacy in her own house, even if it is open to the public." She brushed past Nancy, only to confront Mr. Drew, who, attracted by the sharp tone of the voices, had entered the room to investigate. "What is the trouble?" he asked. "No trouble at all, thank you," Mrs. Semmit said. "Just a little misunderstanding." I happened to see Mr. Semmit pass an envelope in through the window when your back was turned, Nancy said. Nancy's announcement was like a bombshell to Mrs. Semmit. In her agitation, she dropped the envelope, and Nancy swiftly stooped and picked it up. There is a misunderstanding, she said. This is addressed to Mr. Sidney, after all. It isn't. Her voice grew sharp. It isn't yours, is it, Mrs. Semmit? No, I was just taking it up to the old gentleman, Mrs. Semmit said, blinking and running her tongue over her dry lips. Then I apologize for detaining you, Nancy smiled. I see it as a registered letter from the Midwestern Gas and Power Company, so it must be important. Without another word, Mrs. Semmit hurried up the stairs. Nancy, with a roguish wink at her father, asked him if it was not time to go home. Yes, my business here is finished, Carson Drew said, regarding his daughter with frank admiration. You have just given me some very valuable information, whether you know it or not. I was trying to give you information on the chance that it might be valuable, Nancy replied. I saw Semmit sneak that letter into his wife, and if it hadn't been for that bit of luck, I doubt if Mr. Sidney would have ever received it. As Nancy drove the car home, Mr. Drew told her that among the assets Mr. Sidney had included in his estate were several shares of stock in the power company, but that the old man had expressed the belief they were worthless because he had received no dividends in 4 years. I have some of that stock myself, Mr. Drew said. It is a sound and conservative investment, which always pays its dividends promptly, so I knew someone was intercepting Mr. Sidney's checks. If you had not performed that very clever piece of detective work, it would have been hard to trace the theft or to prove it. Then you do suspect the Semmits of robbing Mr. Sidney? Nancy asked. I'm certain of it, Mr. Drew said with conviction. Mr. Sidney did not know his home had been converted into a public inn until I told him. Gradually through the years, the Semmits, whom he had employed as housekeepers and gardeners, have shunted him to the 3rd floor, and his personal desire to be alone helped their scheme. Meanwhile, Semmit has rented out acres of the estate to local farmers and pocketed the money, I believe. Then let me add to your suspicions, Nancy said, slowing the car. This morning I saw Semmit bury a wooden chest under a woodpile. When you sent me for Mr. Hill, I unearthed the box first. It took only a minute, and I put it in a vault in the bank. I have a receipt for it. Nancy, that was rather high-handed, Mr. Drew said reprovingly. It may contain Mr. Semmit's personal property. I don't think so, because it bore a label saying very plainly that the contents were valuable personal property of Asa Sidney, Nancy replied. Furthermore, I recognized the box as one I saw in the old man's room last night. We will take Mr. Sidney to the bank to identify the box, Mr. Drew said. If it was taken from his room, that alone is enough to put Semmit behind the bars. I am sorry that my confidence in you was a little shaken, Nancy dear. I ought to know by now that I can depend upon you. Nancy smiled happily at her father's praise and stepped on the accelerator to speed the car homeward. Mr. Drew described some of his conversation with Mr. Sidney and explained that the aged recluse was suspicious that his fortune was being tapped by thieving hands, although so cleverly he could not prevent it. He is rather contemptuous of money, although he is really a rich man, Mr. Drew said. So long as he has his room and his meals and materials with which to experiment and mold candles, he does not care particularly about anything else. Except one person. Sadie? Nancy asked, as she drew the car to a halt in front of their beautiful home. There are some things I must keep secret, even from you, Nancy, Mr. Drew said as he stepped from the car. What a lawyer learns in confidence, he must keep in confidence, even from loving and trustworthy daughters. However, you will know everything eventually. Everything, that is, except why Mr. Sidney wants to do a certain thing. That is a great mystery to me." "More mystery!" Nancy cried as she entered the house with her parent. "Oh, I wish you could give me just a hint, Dad. But no, I should not ask that. I know that your lips are sealed." "It will tax your ingenuity when it is made public," Mr. Drew said with a shake of his head. "Speaking of added mysteries," Nancy said, "do you think we could find out who Sadie's parents were?" Mr. Drew stared at his daughter oddly. "You know she is an orphan," Nancy explained. "She was found in a church, she told me. The Semmits reared her, although I don't think they legally adopted her." "One thing at a time, Nancy," Mr. Drew chuckled. "We have an hour and a half before Hannah puts the dinner on the table, and I want to spend that time in going through some old files I have, which may throw some light on angles of this case, I hope." "Then I think I'll run downtown for a while," Nancy observed. She changed into a lighter frock, for the afternoon had become warm and sultry. It was a simple and inexpensive dress of white silk which she had selected, with a loosely tied scarf of vivid blue sprinkled with a design of yellow blossoms for a touch of brightness. White stockings and white kid slippers completed the outfit, and Nancy made a very pretty picture indeed, with her fresh, natural color and crisp golden hair as she re-entered her snappy little roadster and headed it toward the center of River Heights. Nancy's objective was the home of her chum, Bess Marvin. When she reached the modest dwelling place, she noticed a familiar automobile parked in front. It was Peter Boonton's car. For a moment, Nancy debated whether to call for her friend or drive on to Bess's cousin, George Fane, and discuss with her a visit to Asa Sidney. But then the matter was settled for her by seeing George cross the room that fronted on the street. Something seems to be on George's mind, Nancy thought, as she pocketed the key to her car and started for the house. I am sure she saw me, though she gave no sign of recognition. Bess answered the doorbell. She smiled, almost as if in spite of herself. "Hello, Nancy," she said, closing the door behind her and joining her friend in the open air. "Uncle Peter's inside. I hear you were at the Sign of the Twisted Candles again today." "That's what I've come to talk to you about, Bess," Nancy exclaimed. "Call George, won't you? I have some exciting things to tell you, and we must plan another visit out there." "Oh, I don't think I care to come," Bess replied airily. "And I'm sure George isn't interested." Nancy flushed with disappointment and embarrassment at Bess's cool retort. "Well, that's too bad," she said with a lump in her throat. "Dad has been retained as lawyer by Mr. Sidney, and some interesting problems have developed. We'd have fun tackling them." "Oh, so your father is really taking sides in the case, is he?" Bess asked frigidly. "I'm sorry, I must go help with supper. Good night." Stung by the snub of her lifelong friend, Nancy ran to her car and drove furiously toward home, tears brimming in her velvet blue eyes. What had come over Bess? What sinister influence in the bitter Boonton-Sidney feud had brought this sorrow to her? End of chapter 13.